What if the ugliest gift you ever received turned out to be the one thing you couldn't live without? In the heart of 1859 Georgia, one plantation mistress thought she was sending a cruel joke. Instead, she handed her rival the weapon that would shatter an empire built on cotton and cruelty. This is the true hidden story of Lila Harper, a scarred field hand who outsmarted the antebellum elite with nothing but a secret education and unbreakable will. Buckle up, because this tale of revenge, romance, and revolution is about to blow your mind. My name is Lila, and I learned early that beauty in the antebellum South was measured not by the soul, but by the shade of one's skin and the symmetry of one's features. In both regards, I was found wanting by those who claimed ownership over my life. It was the spring of 1859 in Georgia, where the magnolia bloomed white as the cotton that built fortunes on the backs of my people. I worked the fields of Willow Bend Plantation, owned by Madame Evelyn Langford, a woman whose beauty was legendary throughout the Piedmont, and whose cruelty was whispered about in slave quarters from Augusta to Macon. Evelyn was 27 that year, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, and blue eyes that could charm a man or freeze his blood depending on her mood. She had inherited Willow Bend from her father and ran it with an iron fist wrapped in lace gloves. The white society adored her. The slaves feared her with good reason. I was 23 and everything Evelyn was not. Where she was fair, I was dark as rich earth. Where her skin was smooth as porcelain, mine bore the scars of smallpox that had nearly killed me as a child. Where she was curved and soft, I was angular and strong from years of fieldwork. By the standards of that time and place, I was considered ugly, worthless, except for the labor my body could provide. But appearances, as I would soon prove, can be devastatingly deceiving. The morning that would change everything began like any other. I was in the cotton fields before dawn, my hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been picking cotton since childhood. The work was backbreaking, bent over for hours under the merciless Georgia sun, filling basket after basket with the white gold that made men like Evelyn's father rich beyond imagination. Around me, 40 other slaves worked in similar silence. There was old Josiah, whose back was permanently bent from 50 years in these fields. There was young Clara, barely 16, whose quick fingers could pick twice as much cotton as anyone else. There was Nathan, a man of perhaps 30, who had been sold away from his wife and children in Virginia, and still carried that grief like a physical weight. We were a community bound by suffering, but also by small acts of kindness that made survival possible. When someone's water gourd ran dry, others shared. When a child fell sick, the whole quarters rallied to help. When the overseer's whip fell too heavily, we tended each other's wounds and whispered words of comfort. But Evelyn saw none of this humanity. To her, we were simply tools, no different from the plows and cotton gins that helped her extract wealth from the land. She made regular tours of the fields, not to check on our welfare, but to ensure we were working hard enough to justify our existence. Lila. Evelyn's voice cut across the cotton field like a whip crack. Come here, girl. I straightened from my work, my back aching from hours bent over the cotton plants. The other field hands avoided my eyes. Being singled out by the mistress was never good news. I walked toward the big house, my bare feet silent on the red dirt path. Evelyn stood on the wide veranda resplendent in a dress of emerald silk that cost more than most slaves would earn in a lifetime if they were paid for their labor. The dress was perfectly fitted to her hourglass figure, its rich color complementing her golden hair and fair skin. She wore pearls at her throat and diamonds in her ears, jewelry that had been bought with the sweat and blood of people like me. Beside her stood a man I recognized as Colonel Marcus Ellington, owner of the neighboring plantation, and one of the most eligible widowers in the county. He was perhaps 45, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed uncomfortable with Evelyn's display of wealth and power. This is the one I was telling you about, Evelyn said to the colonel, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Lila, show the colonel your face. I raised my eyes, knowing what he would see. The pockmarked skin, the too wide nose, the lips that white society deemed too full. I had learned long ago not to flinch from such scrutiny, though it never stopped hurting. Colonel Ellington was a man of perhaps 45, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed uncomfortable with Evelyn's display. "She's certainly unique," he said diplomatically, and I heard something in his voice that surprised me. Not disgust or amusement, but a kind of gentle discomfort with the situation. Evelyn laughed, a sound like silver bells hiding poison. "Unique is one word for it. She's been with us for years, working the fields, strong as an ox, though not much to look at. But Marcus, you mentioned needing help with your library." I kept my expression carefully blank, but inside my mind was racing. I knew exactly what Evelyn was doing. She had been courting Colonel Ellington since his wife's death 6 months earlier, seeing in him an opportunity to expand her holdings and influence. The colonel owned Oak Ridge, a smaller but prosperous plantation that bordered Willow Bend. A marriage between them would create one of the largest holdings in the county, but the colonel had been hesitant to commit, perhaps sensing the cruelty that lurked beneath her beautiful exterior. I had heard the house slaves gossiping about their courtship, how he was always polite but never passionate, how he seemed to find excuses to cut their visits short, how he had not yet proposed, despite months of Evelyn's increasingly obvious hints. What Evelyn didn't know, what no one knew except the man who had taught me, was that I could read, not just simple words, but Latin, French, and Greek. I had been educated in secret by Evelyn's own uncle, a man named Theodore Langford, who had developed abolitionist sympathies before his death 3 years earlier. Theodore had been different from the rest of his family. During his visits to Willow Bend, he had noticed my intelligence and began teaching me in secret, recognizing a hunger for knowledge that burned brighter than any physical beauty. He would slip me books hidden in baskets of vegetables, teach me letters scratched in the dirt behind the smokehouse, quiz me on grammar and philosophy during brief encounters when no one else was watching. "Knowledge is power, Lila," he had told me during one of our secret lessons, "and power properly used can break any chain." When he died, he had left me a hidden cache of books in the plantation's old smokehouse, along with a letter explaining his hope that education might someday be my path to freedom. I had spent 3 years reading everything he left me, works of philosophy, literature, science, and history that had opened my mind to possibilities I had never imagined. "I think Lila would be perfect for your needs," Evelyn continued, her smile growing sharper. "Consider her a gift, an engagement present, if you will." The colonel shifted uncomfortably. "Evelyn, I haven't actually proposed." "Oh, but you will," she said with absolute confidence. "And when you do, you'll have the perfect slave to tend your books. Won't that be wonderful?" I understood the game now. Evelyn was offering me as a deliberately insulting gift, expecting the colonel to be horrified by my appearance and reject both me and her. This would give her grounds to break off their courtship while maintaining her reputation as the wronged party. She could claim that the colonel had insulted her by rejecting her generous gift, making him the villain in their failed romance. It was a cruel, calculated move that would humiliate both the colonel and myself. But Evelyn had made one critical error. She had never bothered to discover what lay beneath my scarred exterior. "That's very generous," Colonel Ellington said slowly, his eyes meeting mine for a moment. I saw something there. Not disgust or pity, but curiosity. "When would this transfer take place?" "Tomorrow, if you like. I'll have her cleaned up and sent over with her few belongings. I'm sure you'll find her adequate for your purposes." The way Evelyn said adequate made it clear she expected the opposite. She was practically purring with satisfaction, already imagining the colonel's horror when he realized what kind of gift he had received. That night, I sat in my small cabin and prepared for what might be my only chance to change my fate. The cabin I shared with 2 other women was barely 10 ft square, with a dirt floor and walls that let in wind and rain. Our furniture consisted of 3 straw pallets, a wooden bucket, and a small table made from a tree stump. I gathered the books Theodore had left me, hiding them in a cloth bundle along with my few possessions: a spare dress, a wooden comb, and a small mirror that had belonged to my mother. I also wrote a letter, something I had never dared to do before, explaining my situation and my capabilities, just in case the colonel proved to be a man who could see beyond appearances. As I prepared for sleep, I thought about Evelyn's plan and smiled grimly. She thought she was sending Colonel Ellington an ugly, ignorant field hand who would embarrass him and drive him away. Instead, she was about to give him exactly what he needed most, though neither of them knew it yet. The next morning dawned clear and bright, full of possibilities that Evelyn could never have imagined. As I walked the path between Willow Bend and Ellington plantations, carrying my hidden books and my secret knowledge, I felt something I had never experienced before. Hope. Evelyn Langford thought she was playing a game of chess with human pieces. She was about to discover that some pawns could become queens, and that the ugly slave she was discarding might be the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced. The war between us was about to begin, though she didn't know it yet, and by the time she realized what she had done, it would be far too late to take it back. Colonel Marcus Ellington's plantation, Oak Ridge, was smaller than Willow Bend, but more elegantly appointed. As I walked up the oak-lined drive carrying my meager bundle, I could see the difference immediately. The slave quarters were better maintained. The fields showed signs of crop rotation, and there was an air of order without the underlying fear that permeated Evelyn's domain. The house itself was a modest two-story structure, built in the Georgian style with white columns and wide verandas that caught the morning breeze. Unlike Willow Bend's ostentatious display of wealth, Oak Ridge spoke of quiet prosperity and good taste. The gardens were well tended but not elaborate, and I noticed that the slave quarters, while still simple, had glass windows and stone chimneys, luxuries that Evelyn would never have provided. The colonel met me at the front steps of his modest but well-appointed house. In daylight, away from Evelyn's overwhelming presence, I could see him more clearly. He was a man of medium height with intelligent gray eyes and hands that bore ink stains, the mark of someone who spent time writing. There was a gentleness about him that seemed at odds with his military title, and I noticed that he looked directly at me when he spoke, not through me as most white people did. "Lila, isn't it?" he said, his voice kind but uncertain. "I must admit I'm not entirely sure what Madame Langford expects you to do here." "She mentioned your library, sir," I replied, keeping my eyes respectfully downcast, while my mind raced with possibilities. "Yes, well," he seemed embarrassed. "I do have quite a collection of books. Perhaps you could help with dusting, organizing, that sort of thing." I nodded, but inside I was calculating. This was my moment, the chance to reveal my true capabilities without seeming threatening or presumptuous. I had to be careful. A slave who appeared too educated could face severe punishment or worse. "If I may ask, sir, what languages are your books written in?" He looked surprised by the question. "Languages? Well, mostly English, of course, some Latin texts, a few French volumes." "Why do you ask?" "I thought it might help with the organizing, sir, to know which books go together." "I see." He studied me with new interest. "And you would know how to identify these different languages?" "Yes, sir. I was taught some letters by Master Theodore before he passed." It was a careful half-truth. Theodore had indeed taught me, but far more than some letters. I watched the colonel's face carefully, seeing recognition dawn in his eyes at the mention of Evelyn's uncle. "Theodore Langford taught you to read some, sir. He said it would make me more useful." Colonel Ellington was quiet for a long moment, then gestured toward the house. "Come, let me show you the library." As we walked through the house, I took note of everything. The furnishings were comfortable but not luxurious, well-made pieces that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. The walls were lined with paintings and prints, mostly landscapes and portraits that seemed chosen for personal meaning rather than monetary value. It was the home of a man who valued substance over show. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive oak desk covered with papers and tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. But I could see immediately that it was in chaos. Books were scattered randomly. Papers were piled without organization, and there was a layer of dust over everything that suggested the colonel rarely used this beautiful space. "As you can see, it needs work," he said almost apologetically. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with organization." I walked slowly around the room, my eyes taking in the titles. I could see works of philosophy, history, literature, science, a collection that would be the envy of any university. I saw Plato's Republic sitting next to a treatise on agricultural techniques, Virgil's Aeneid mixed in with modern novels, scientific journals scattered among poetry collections. It was clear that the colonel was overwhelmed by his own library. "Sir, if I may," I approached one of the shelves where Latin texts were mixed randomly with English novels. "Would you like me to group similar books together? You can tell which ones are similar." This was my test. I reached for a volume of Virgil's Aeneid and opened it to a random page. I read aloud, then looked up at his astonished face. "It's the opening of the Aeneid, sir. I sing of arms, and the man who first from the shores of Troy." The colonel's mouth fell open. "You can read Latin?" "Yes, sir. Master Theodore taught me." He said Virgil was important for understanding the classical tradition. Good God. He sank into a chair, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "What else did Theodore teach you?" "French, sir. Some Greek, mathematics, natural philosophy, history." I paused, gauging his reaction. He said knowledge was the one thing that could never be taken away from a person. Theodore always was the philosopher of the family. The colonel shook his head in amazement. "Lila, I must ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Can you write as well as read?" "Yes, sir." "And you understand what you read? You're not just reciting sounds." "I understand, sir." Master Theodore made sure of that. He said there was no point in reading words if you couldn't think about their meaning. Colonel Ellington stood and walked to his desk where papers lay scattered in apparent disorder. I could see letters half-written, documents with corrections scratched out, and what appeared to be business correspondence that had been started and abandoned. "I have a confession to make, Lila. I've been struggling with something my entire life, something I've never told anyone. I have great difficulty reading. The letters seem to move around on the page, and I often confuse words that look similar. It's why I became a soldier rather than a scholar. I could lead men, but I could never master books the way I wanted to. I felt a surge of understanding and sympathy. You have what the Greeks called word blindness, sir. It's not uncommon among intelligent people. Master Theodore told me about it." Theodore knew about this condition. He said some of the greatest minds in history struggled with reading, sir. Julius Caesar for one, but that there were ways to work around it, ways to access knowledge through other means. The colonel's eyes lit up with something I had rarely seen in a white person's face when looking at a slave. "Hope. Would you be able to help me to read things aloud? Perhaps help me organize my correspondence? I would be honored, sir." And so began the most extraordinary partnership of my life. Over the following days, I transformed Colonel Ellington's library from chaos into order, grouping books by subject and language, creating a catalog system that allowed him to find what he needed quickly. More importantly, I began reading to him not just letters and documents, but poetry, philosophy, and literature. For the first time in his life, the colonel could engage with the world of ideas that had always been closed to him. And for the first time in mine, I could use my mind for something other than survival, but I was careful to maintain the appearance of servitude. When other whites visited, I became invisible, dusting shelves while they talked. When the colonel had guests for dinner, I served silently, giving no sign of the conversations we had shared about Plato or Rousseau. The other slaves at Oak Ridge watched these developments with a mixture of curiosity and concern. There was Hannah, the cook, who had been with the colonel's family for 20 years and knew all the plantation's secrets. There was Caleb, the head groom, who managed the horses with quiet competence. There was young Eli, barely 18, who worked in the house and had dreams of someday earning enough to buy his freedom. That new girl from Willow Bend, I heard Hannah telling Caleb one evening as I passed by the kitchen. She's got some kind of hold on the master. Spends all day in that library with him. What kind of hold? Caleb asked. Don't know, but it ain't natural a slave spending so much time alone with the master. Makes me nervous. I understood their concern. In their experience, when masters took special interest in female slaves, it usually meant one thing. But what the colonel and I shared was something entirely different. A meeting of minds that transcended the artificial barriers of race and class. During our reading sessions, I began to understand the man behind the title. Marcus Ellington had inherited his plantation and his military rank, but he had always felt inadequate compared to his more educated peers. His reading difficulties had made him feel stupid, even though his intelligence was obvious in other ways. He was a natural leader, a skilled military strategist, and a compassionate employer who treated his slaves better than most. "Read that section again, Lila," he said one afternoon as we worked through Tocqueville's observations on American democracy. The part about the tyranny of the majority. I found the passage and read, "I know of no country in which there is so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America." Fascinating, the colonel mused. A Frenchman sees clearly what we Americans prefer to ignore. What do you think, Lila? Does Tocqueville have a point? It was a question that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. A white man asking a slave for her opinion on political philosophy. But our relationship had evolved beyond the traditional boundaries, even as we maintained the appearance of propriety when others were present. "I think, sir, that any society built on the premise that some people are property will struggle with true freedom of thought," I replied carefully. "How can there be real discussion when half the population isn't allowed to speak?" He nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, of course, though I wonder if change might be possible without violence. These conversations were dangerous territory, but they were also necessary." I was slowly, carefully introducing ideas that challenged the colonel's assumptions about slavery and society. Not through direct confrontation, but through the books we read together and the questions they raised. My influence extended beyond the library. The colonel had begun asking my opinion on plantation matters, disguising it as requests for help with correspondence. When he wrote to his cotton broker, I would suggest more favorable terms. When he planned crop rotations, I would mention agricultural techniques I had learned from Theodore's books. Gradually, imperceptibly, I was becoming his most trusted advisor. The other slaves at Oak Ridge noticed the change too. Word spread that the new girl from Willow Bend had some kind of special influence with the master. Some were suspicious, others hopeful. I was careful to use my position to improve conditions when possible, suggesting that better-fed slaves worked more efficiently, that adequate rest prevented injuries, that treating people with basic dignity increased loyalty. "Master's been different since you came," Hannah told me one evening as we prepared dinner together. "Kinder somehow, more thoughtful." "How so?" "Well, yesterday he asked me if the kitchen was too hot in summer, if we needed better ventilation. Never asked nothing like that before. And he's been talking about building a school for the children." "A school?" "Says educated workers are more valuable. Of course he don't mean real education, just enough reading and writing to be useful. But still," I smiled to myself. The colonel was beginning to see his slaves as human beings rather than property. And that change in perspective was already bearing fruit. It was a small step, but an important one. But I knew this delicate balance couldn't last forever. Evelyn Langford was not a woman to accept defeat gracefully, and she would soon realize that her cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. The confrontation came on a humid August evening, when Evelyn arrived unannounced for dinner. I was serving in the dining room, invisible as always when white guests were present, but my ears were attuned to every word. "Marcus, darling," Evelyn said, her voice honey-sweet with underlying steel, "I've been hearing the most interesting rumors about you and that slave I gave you." "What sort of rumors?" the colonel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Oh, just silly talk about how much time you spend with her. People are saying she's become quite indispensable to you. I could feel the danger in the air like electricity before a storm." Evelyn was probing, looking for weakness, preparing to strike. "Lila has been very helpful with organizing my library," the colonel replied. "She has a natural aptitude for such work." "Natural aptitude," Evelyn repeated, her laugh like breaking glass. "How charming. And what exactly does this natural aptitude involve?" "She can read, Evelyn. Your uncle taught her before he died." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Evelyn's face in profile, and the expression there was one of pure, cold fury. "Read," she said finally. "You mean she recognizes a few simple words?" "No. I mean she can read Latin, French, and English fluently. She's been helping me with my correspondence and research." Evelyn's wine glass shattered in her hand, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "That's impossible. She's a field slave barely above an animal. Uncle Theodore would never have." "Your uncle was a remarkable man," the colonel interrupted. "And Lila is a remarkable woman." I've never met anyone, black or white, with such a keen intellect. The word woman hung in the air between them. Not slave or girl or property, but woman. Evelyn heard it too, and I saw her face go white with rage. Marcus, you're being ridiculous. She's a slave, a piece of property. You can't possibly. I can, and I do, he said firmly. Lila has become invaluable to me, and I won't have her insulted in my home. Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I see what's happening here. That creature has bewitched you somehow. Used some kind of voodoo, or the only magic Lila possesses is intelligence and education, the colonel said, rising as well. Something you might understand if you bothered to look beyond appearances. How dare you? Evelyn's mask of civility finally slipped completely. I am Evelyn Langford. I am beautiful, cultured, everything a man could want. And you're choosing that hideous creature over me? The colonel's voice was ice cold when he replied. Beauty fades, Evelyn, but a beautiful mind is forever. And between the two of you, there's no contest about who possesses true beauty. Evelyn's scream of rage echoed through the house. She swept toward the door, then turned back for one final blow. You'll regret this, Marcus Ellington. Both of you will regret this. I'll make sure of it. After she left, the colonel found me in the kitchen, where I was cleaning up the broken glass and spilled wine with shaking hands. Lila, he said softly, I'm sorry you had to hear that. It's nothing I haven't heard before, sir. No, it's not nothing, and you shouldn't have to endure such treatment. He paused, then said something that changed everything between us. Lila, I want you to know that what I said in there, I meant every word. You are remarkable, and I've come to care for you deeply. I looked up at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. Sir, I know it's impossible. I know the world would never accept it, but I needed you to know. It's not impossible, sir, I said quietly. Just dangerous. That night, as I lay in my small room adjacent to the library, I thought about Evelyn's threats and the colonel's declaration. I knew that Evelyn would not simply accept defeat. She would find a way to destroy what we were building, to punish us both for defying her expectations. But I also knew something Evelyn didn't understand. She thought she was fighting a slave who had gotten above her station. In reality, she was about to face an opponent who had spent years learning to survive, to think strategically, to turn weakness into strength. Evelyn Langford had created her own nemesis when she sent me to Colonel Ellington as a cruel joke. Now she was about to discover just how dangerous an educated, motivated, and angry woman could be, regardless of the color of her skin. The real war was about to begin, and I intended to win it. 3 months passed at Oak Ridge, and I watched Colonel Ellington transform from a man ashamed of his limitations into someone confident in his intellectual abilities. Our daily reading sessions had become the highlight of both our days. I would read aloud while he listened, occasionally stopping to discuss complex passages or debate philosophical points. The library had become our sanctuary, a place where the artificial barriers of race and class seemed to dissolve in the face of shared intellectual curiosity. We had established a routine. Mornings were devoted to correspondence and practical matters, afternoons to literature and philosophy, evenings to planning the next day's work. Read that section again, Lila, he said one afternoon as we worked through Tocqueville's observations on American democracy. The part about the tyranny of the majority. I found the passage and read, I know of no country in which there is so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America. Fascinating. The colonel mused, a Frenchman sees clearly what we Americans prefer to ignore. What do you think, Lila? Does Tocqueville have a point? It was a question that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. A white man asking a slave for her opinion on political philosophy, but our relationship had evolved beyond the traditional boundaries, even as we maintained the appearance of propriety when others were present. I think, sir, that any society built on the premise that some people are property will struggle with true freedom of thought, I replied carefully. How can there be real discussion when half the population isn't allowed to speak? He nodded thoughtfully. You're right, of course, though I wonder if change might be possible without violence. History suggests that entrenched power, rarely yields to reason alone, sir. The Roman Republic fell because the patricians refused to share power with the plebeians. The French Revolution happened because the aristocracy wouldn't reform voluntarily. But surely there must be a middle path, some way to achieve justice without bloodshed. I set down the book and looked at him directly. Sir, with respect, you're asking that question from a position of privilege. For those of us who have nothing to lose, the calculation is different. These conversations were dangerous territory, but they were also necessary. I was slowly, carefully introducing ideas that challenged the Colonel's assumptions about slavery and society, not through direct confrontation, but through the books we read together and the questions they raised. My influence extended beyond the library. The Colonel had begun asking my opinion on plantation matters, disguising it as requests for help with correspondence. When he wrote to his cotton broker, I would suggest more favorable terms. When he planned crop rotations, I would mention agricultural techniques I had learned from Theodore's books. Gradually, imperceptibly, I was becoming his most trusted advisor. Lila, he said one morning as we reviewed the plantation's financial records, I've been thinking about what you said regarding worker productivity. You mentioned that better living conditions might actually increase profits. Yes, sir. Healthy, well-rested workers are more efficient, and workers who feel they have a stake in the outcome work harder than those who are simply driven by fear. What would you suggest? I had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Better food, sir. Adequate medical care, perhaps some small incentives for exceptional work, extra rations or time off on Sundays. And you think this would improve productivity enough to offset the additional costs? I think it would do more than that, sir. I think it would reduce the need for overseers and punishment, which are significant expenses in themselves. The Colonel was quiet for a moment, then made a note in his ledger. Draw up a proposal, Lila. Specific recommendations with cost estimates. I'd like to review it. It was a remarkable request, a slave being asked to develop policy for managing other slaves, but it was also an opportunity to improve the lives of my fellow bondspeople, and I intended to make the most of it. The other slaves at Oak Ridge noticed the changes immediately. The food improved, more meat, fresh vegetables, adequate portions. A doctor was brought in to treat the sick, rather than simply letting them recover or die on their own. Work schedules were adjusted to allow for rest during the hottest parts of the day. That new girl's got some kind of magic, I heard Caleb telling Hannah one evening. Master's been different since she came. Kinder, more human. Magic or not, Hannah replied. I ain't complaining. My rheumatism's been better since he started giving us that medicine. And did you see? He's talking about building a proper school for the children. The school was my idea, presented as a way to increase the value of the plantation's human assets. Educated slaves are worth more, sir, I had told the Colonel, and they're less likely to run away if they have something to lose. It was a cynical argument, but one that appealed to his practical nature while achieving my real goal, giving the children of Oak Ridge something I had been lucky to receive from Theodore Langford. But I knew this delicate balance couldn't last forever. Evelyn Langford was not a woman to accept defeat gracefully, and she would soon realize that her cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. The first sign of trouble came in the form of visitors, white men from neighboring plantations, who arrived unannounced and asked pointed questions about the Colonel's management practices. Heard you've been making some changes around here, Ellington, said Mr. Hargrove, a thin man with cold eyes who owned the plantation to our south. Treating your slaves mighty well, from what I hear. I treat them as I would any valuable asset, the Colonel replied carefully. Well-maintained property lasts longer and performs better. That's one way to look at it, said Mr. Donovan, another neighbor. Of course, some folks might say you're spoiling them, making them think they're something more than what they are. And what would that be, Donovan? Property, Ellington. Nothing more, nothing less. Start treating them like people and they start getting ideas. Ideas that spread to other plantations. The threat was clear. The Colonel's reforms were being seen as dangerous by other slaveholders who feared that better treatment might inspire their own slaves to demand similar conditions. I'll manage my plantation as I see fit, the Colonel said firmly, and I'll thank you gentlemen to do the same with yours. After they left, I found the Colonel in his study staring out the window with a troubled expression. They're afraid, sir, I said quietly. Of what? of the idea that slaves might be human beings deserving of basic dignity. Because if that's true, then everything they've built is founded on a lie. He turned to look at me. And is it, Lila? Is everything we've built here founded on a lie? It was a moment of truth, and I chose to meet it honestly. Yes, sir, it is. But that doesn't mean it can't become something better. What would better look like? Freedom, sir. Real freedom. Not just for me, but for all of us. That's a dangerous word, Lila. Yes, sir, it is. But some words are worth the danger. The confrontation with Evelyn came 2 weeks later on a humid August evening, when she arrived unannounced for dinner. I was serving in the dining room, invisible as always, when white guests were present, but my ears were attuned to every word. "Marcus, darling," Evelyn said, her voice honey with underlying steel. "I've been hearing the most interesting rumors about you and that slave I gave you." "What sort of rumors?" the colonel asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Oh, just silly talk about how much time you spend with her. People are saying she's become quite indispensable to you. I could feel the danger in the air like electricity before a storm." Evelyn was probing, looking for weakness, preparing to strike. "Lila has been very helpful with organizing my library," the colonel replied. "She has a natural aptitude for such work." "Natural aptitude," Evelyn repeated, her laugh like breaking glass. "How charming. And what exactly does this natural aptitude involve?" "She can read, Evelyn. Your uncle taught her before he died." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Evelyn's face in profile, and the expression there was one of pure cold fury. "Read," she said finally. "For you mean she recognizes a few simple words?" "No, I mean she can read Latin, French, and English fluently. She's been helping me with my correspondence and research." Evelyn's wine glass shattered in her hand, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "That's impossible. She's a field slave barely above an animal. Uncle Theodore would never have." "Your uncle was a remarkable man," the colonel interrupted, "and Lila is a remarkable woman. I've never met anyone, black or white, with such a keen intellect." The word woman hung in the air between them. Not slave or girl or property, but woman. Evelyn heard it too, and I saw her face go white with rage. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous. She's a slave, a piece of property. You can't possibly." "I can and I do," he said firmly. "Lila has become invaluable to me, and I won't have her insulted in my home." Evelyn stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I see what's happening here. That creature has bewitched you somehow. Used some kind of voodoo, or the only magic Lila possesses is intelligence and education," the colonel said, rising as well. "Something you might understand if you bothered to look beyond appearances." "How dare you?" Evelyn's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "I am Evelyn Langford. I am beautiful, cultured, everything a man could want, and you're choosing that hideous creature over me." The colonel's voice was ice cold when he replied, "Beauty fades, Evelyn, but a beautiful mind is forever, and between the two of you, there's no contest about who possesses true beauty." Evelyn's scream of rage echoed through the house. She swept toward the door, then turned back for one final blow. "You'll regret this, Marcus Ellington. Both of you will regret this. I'll make sure of it." After she left, the colonel found me in the kitchen, where I was cleaning up the broken glass and spilled wine with shaking hands. "Lila," he said softly, "I'm sorry you had to hear that. It's nothing I haven't heard before, sir. No, it's not nothing, and you shouldn't have to endure such treatment." He paused, then said something that changed everything between us. "Lila, I want you to know that what I said in there, I meant every word. You are remarkable, and I've come to care for you deeply." I looked up at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. "Sir, I know it's impossible. I know the world would never accept it, but I needed you to know." "It's not impossible, sir," I said quietly. "Just dangerous." "What would you have me do, Lila? How can we build something real in a world that sees us as master and property?" "We start by acknowledging what we already know, sir, that those categories are lies. That whatever we are to each other, it has nothing to do with ownership. And then we decide what we're willing to risk for the truth." That night, as I lay in my small room adjacent to the library, I thought about Evelyn's threats and the Colonel's declaration. I knew that Evelyn would not simply accept defeat. She would find a way to destroy what we were building, to punish us both for defying her expectations. But I also knew something Evelyn didn't understand. She thought she was fighting a slave who had gotten above her station. In reality, she was about to face an opponent who had spent years learning to survive, to think strategically, to turn weakness into strength. Evelyn Langford had created her own nemesis when she sent me to Colonel Ellington as a cruel joke. Now she was about to discover just how dangerous an educated, motivated, and angry woman could be, regardless of the color of her skin. The real war was about to begin, and I intended to win it. Evelyn's revenge began subtly, as the most effective attacks always do. Within a week of her humiliation at dinner, rumors began circulating through Augusta society about Colonel Ellington's unnatural attachment to his slave. The whispers followed a predictable pattern, first suggesting that he was being manipulated by voodoo, then implying more scandalous possibilities. I learned of these rumors through the network of house slaves who moved between plantations, carrying news along with their master's correspondence. Clara, who worked at the Hargrove plantation, brought word during her Sunday visit to see her husband at Oak Ridge. "They saying terrible things about you and the Colonel," she whispered as we walked near the slave quarters. "Miss Evelyn been visiting all the ladies, telling them you got some kind of hold on him." "What kind of hold?" I asked, though I could guess. "The kind that makes white folks real angry. They saying you using conjure to make him forget his place. Some even saying she lowered her voice further. Some saying you sharing his bed." I felt a chill run through me. In the antebellum South, the mere suggestion of a romantic relationship between a white man and a black woman could be a death sentence for both parties, though the woman would always bear the greater punishment. And what does the Colonel say to these rumors? That's the strange part. He ain't denying nothing, just tells folks his business is his own, and they can think what they please. This was both admirable and dangerous. The Colonel's refusal to bow to social pressure showed his integrity, but it also made him a target. Evelyn was counting on the community's outrage to force him to choose between his reputation and his relationship with me. The pressure intensified over the following weeks. Business associates began canceling meetings. Social invitations dried up. The local bank started asking pointed questions about the plantation's loans. Evelyn was orchestrating a systematic campaign to isolate the Colonel economically and socially. "It's working," Hannah told me one evening as we prepared dinner. "Master's been getting letters all week. Bad news from the look of his face." I knew I had to act. That night after our usual reading session, I broached the subject directly. "Sir, I've been hearing things about us, about what people are saying." The Colonel looked up from the letter I had been reading to him, his expression troubled. "I've heard them too, Lila. I'm sorry you have to endure such talk. It's not about what I have to endure, sir. It's about what this could cost you. Your standing in the community, your business relationships, your future." "My future?" He set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Lila, what future would I have without you? Before you came here, I was a lonely man living half a life, ashamed of my limitations and hiding from the world of ideas I longed to join. You've given me more than I ever dared hope for. But the cost of living authentically is always high. But the cost of living a lie is higher." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "I've been thinking about something, Lila. Something that might solve our problem." "What do you mean?" "There are places in the world where what we have wouldn't be seen as scandalous, France, for instance, or certain parts of the North. If we were to leave Georgia, the suggestion hung in the air between us, revolutionary and terrifying." "Sir, you're talking about abandoning everything you've built here. I'm talking about building something new somewhere else together." Before I could respond, we heard the sound of horses approaching the house. The Colonel frowned. It was late for visitors and we weren't expecting anyone. We soon discovered that Evelyn had brought reinforcements. The delegation that entered the library consisted of Evelyn, Sheriff Hargrove, and 2 prominent planters from neighboring counties. Their faces were grim with righteous indignation, and I could smell whiskey on their breath. They had been drinking, working up their courage for this confrontation. "Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with false concern, We've come as friends to discuss a serious matter." "What matter would that be?" the colonel asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sheriff Hargrove stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Colonel Ellington, there have been complaints about your relationship with this slave. Complaints that suggest you may be violating both natural law and state statute. I'm not aware of any laws I've broken, Sheriff." "The law against cohabitation between the races, for one," said Mr. Hargrove, one of the planters. "The law against corrupting the natural order that God established." "I live alone in this house," the colonel replied evenly. "Lila has her own quarters. As for the natural order, I believe God gave all people minds capable of learning and souls capable of love." Evelyn's eyes flashed with triumph. "There, you see. He admits to having unnatural feelings for this creature." "I admit to respecting her intelligence and valuing her companionship," the colonel said. "If that's unnatural, then I'm proud to be unnatural." Mr. Donovan, the second planter, leaned forward aggressively. "Ellington, you're setting a dangerous precedent. Your slaves are getting ideas above their station, and it's spreading to other plantations. We can't allow that. What my slaves think is my business, not yours. It becomes our business when it affects our property." Hargrove snapped. "We've had runaways heading this direction, thinking they'll find some kind of sanctuary here. You're disrupting the entire system." The confrontation escalated quickly from there. The men demanded that I be sold immediately, preferably to a plantation far from Georgia. They threatened to boycott the colonel's business, to ostracize him from society, to make his life unbearable until he came to his senses. "You have until the end of the week to get rid of her," Sheriff Hargrove said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "After that, we'll find legal means to force the issue." "What legal means?" the colonel demanded. "Disturbing the peace, corrupting public morals, inciting rebellion among the slave population." Hargrove's smile was cold. "We'll find something that sticks." Through it all, I stood silently in the corner, officially invisible, but actually the center of everything. I watched Evelyn's face as she orchestrated the attack, seeing the cruel satisfaction there. She thought she was winning, that she had finally found a way to destroy both the colonel and me. But Evelyn had made a critical error. She had brought her battle into the colonel's home in front of his books, surrounded by the knowledge that had become our shared passion. Here, in this sanctuary of learning, her weapons of social pressure and mob intimidation seemed small and petty. "Gentlemen," the colonel said finally, his voice cutting through their threats like a blade, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I must ask you to leave my home." "Now, Marcus, you're making a terrible mistake," Evelyn said, her mask of concern slipping to reveal naked fury. "Choose carefully. Your reputation, your place in society, your very future depends on the decision you make tonight." "Then I choose freely," he replied, moving to stand beside me. "I choose intelligence over ignorance, compassion over cruelty, and truth over the lies that prop up your precious social order." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sheriff Hargrove spoke, his voice heavy with threat. "Colonel, I hope you understand the consequences of your choice. There are laws in this state, and they will be enforced. Then enforce them, Sheriff. But do it legally with proper evidence and due process, not with mob intimidation and social pressure." Evelyn's composure finally cracked completely. "You fool. You're throwing away everything for a slave, a ugly, worthless slave who's bewitched you with her unnatural learning." "The only thing unnatural here," the colonel replied coldly, "is your inability to see past the color of someone's skin to the person beneath." After they left, the colonel and I stood alone in the library, both understanding that everything had changed. The battle lines were now drawn clearly, and there would be no going back. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said quietly. "I've made you a target of their hatred." "No, sir," I replied, feeling a strange sense of liberation. "You've made me something far more dangerous than a target. You've made me an equal, and Evelyn Langford is about to learn what happens when you underestimate an equal opponent." But I knew we needed allies if we were going to survive what was coming. That night I began reaching out through the slave network, sending messages to contacts I had cultivated over the months. If Evelyn wanted a war, she would get one, but not the kind she was expecting. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived, and I intended to fight it with every weapon at my disposal. Intelligence, knowledge, strategy, and the kind of patient, methodical planning that Evelyn's impulsive cruelty could never match. She had started this battle thinking she was destroying a helpless slave. She was about to discover that she had awakened something far more formidable, an educated woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Chapter 5. The price of underestimating intelligence. The attack came 3 weeks later, swift and brutal in its efficiency. I'd been expecting something, but Evelyn's final gambit was more vicious than even I had anticipated. It began with a fire. I woke before dawn to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. Racing to the window, I saw flames consuming the slave quarters, the wooden buildings going up like kindling in the dry autumn air. My first thought was for the people inside, 15 souls who called those simple cabins home. "Fire! Everyone out!" I screamed, running toward the burning buildings in my nightgown. The colonel appeared beside me, both of us organizing the bucket brigade that might save what could be saved. But as we fought the flames, I realized this was no accident. The fire had started in 3 different places simultaneously, and I could smell coal oil, the accelerant that had ensured the buildings would burn quickly and completely. By dawn, the slave quarters were nothing but smoldering ruins. Miraculously, no one had died, though several people suffered burns and smoke inhalation. As we tended to the injured and tried to find temporary shelter for the displaced families, Sheriff Hargrove arrived with a small army of deputies. "Terrible tragedy, Colonel," he said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "Of course, we'll need to investigate, make sure this wasn't some kind of uprising." "Uprising?" the colonel demanded. "These people lost their homes, they're victims, not criminals." "Well, now that's what we need to determine. I'm afraid we'll have to question all your slaves. Make sure they're not hiding anything. And that one there," he pointed directly at me, "she'll need to come with us for special questioning." I felt the trap closing around me. Evelyn had orchestrated this perfectly. The fire would be blamed on slave unrest. I would be arrested as the ringleader, and the colonel would be forced to choose between his reputation and defending me. "On what charges?" the colonel demanded. "Inciting rebellion, destruction of property, conspiracy." Sheriff Hargrove's list was clearly prepared in advance. "We have witnesses who say she's been filling the other slaves' heads with dangerous ideas." "What witnesses?" Evelyn stepped out from behind the sheriff's horse, her face a mask of righteous concern. "I'm afraid I have to speak up, Marcus, for everyone's safety. I've been hearing disturbing reports about this slave's influence over your people, and now this fire." "You're behind this," I said, the words out before I could stop them. "How dare you accuse me?" Evelyn's outrage was perfectly performed. "Sheriff, you see, this is exactly the kind of insolence I've been warning about." The colonel stepped between us, his face pale but determined. "Sheriff Hargrove, I won't allow you to arrest Lila without proper evidence. If you have charges to bring them through proper legal channels. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Colonel. We have a warrant." The paper Sheriff Hargrove produced was official, signed by Judge Hargrove, Evelyn's cousin, and one of the men who had visited us 3 weeks earlier. The charges were serious enough to warrant hanging if I were convicted. As they shackled my hands, I caught the colonel's eye. "Remember what we read about Socrates," I said quietly. "Sometimes the truth is worth dying for." He understood immediately. Socrates had chosen death rather than abandon his principles, believing that an unexamined life was not worth living. I was telling him that I would rather die as a free-thinking woman than live as a broken slave. The Augusta jail was a hellhole of stone and iron, designed to break the spirit before the body. They put me in a cell barely large enough to lie down with no window and only a bucket for sanitation. The message was clear. I was to be treated not as a person awaiting trial, but as a dangerous animal to be caged. But Evelyn had made one crucial mistake. She had assumed that isolating me would break my spirit and make me easier to control. Instead, it gave me time to think, to plan, to prepare for the battle that was coming. I knew the trial would be a sham. The judge was Evelyn's cousin. The jury would be composed of white men who saw me as property, and the outcome was predetermined. But I also knew something Evelyn didn't. The colonel would not abandon me, and together, we had weapons she couldn't imagine. On the third day of my imprisonment, a guard brought me an unexpected visitor, a well-dressed black man who introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a free man from Augusta who worked as a legal clerk. "Colonel Ellington sent me," he said quietly. "He wants you to know that he's fighting for you, but he needs your help." "What kind of help?" "He needs evidence, proof that Evelyn Langford orchestrated the fire and your arrest. Without it, the trial will be exactly what she wants, a legal lynching." I smiled grimly. "Tell the colonel to look in the library. Behind the complete works of Voltaire there's a loose brick. Inside he'll find letters." "What letters?" "Letters Evelyn wrote to her opium supplier in Augusta. Letters detailing her debts, her desperation, her plans to marry the colonel for his money, and most importantly, a letter she wrote to her cousin, the judge, asking him to find a legal solution to the slave problem at Oak Ridge." Daniel's eyes widened. "How did you get these letters?" "Evelyn has been careless with her correspondence for months. She assumes slaves can't read, so she leaves sensitive documents lying around when she visits other plantations. I've been collecting them through the network of house slaves who clean her rooms." It was true. For months I had been building a case against Evelyn, gathering evidence of her corruption, her drug addiction, her financial desperation, and her manipulation of the legal system. I had been preparing for this war long before she fired the first shot. "There's more," I continued. "In the same hiding place there's a detailed financial analysis of Willow Bend Plantation. Evelyn is bankrupt. She's been selling slaves and land to pay her debts, but she's still months away from losing everything. Marrying the colonel was her only hope of avoiding complete ruin." "How did you compile this analysis?" "From plantation records I copied during my visits to neighboring plantations, from conversations overheard by house slaves, from public records available at the courthouse. Evelyn's been living beyond her means for years, supporting her opium habit and maintaining her lifestyle by slowly liquidating her inheritance." Daniel shook his head in amazement. "You've been planning this for months." "I've been preparing for survival. Evelyn Langford thinks she's fighting an ignorant slave. She's actually fighting someone who learned strategy from Caesar, philosophy from Plato, and patience from Marcus Aurelius. She never stood a chance." "There's something else," Daniel said. "The colonel wanted me to tell you that he's hired the best lawyer in Augusta, Thomas Riley. He's expensive, but he's never lost a case involving false accusations, and he's willing to defend a slave. He's willing to defend the truth, and the colonel has offered him a substantial fee." The trial began a week later with all the pomp and prejudice I'd expected. The courthouse was packed with spectators. White society had turned out in force to witness the downfall of the uppity slave who had dared to rise above her station. Evelyn sat in the front row, dressed in black silk like a grieving widow, playing the role of the concerned citizen, protecting society from dangerous slaves. She had clearly prepared for this moment, her appearance calculated to evoke sympathy and righteous indignation. The prosecution's case was straightforward. I was an educated slave who had used my learning to corrupt other slaves and incite rebellion. The fire was presented as evidence of this corruption, and several witnesses testified that I had been seen near the slave quarters shortly before the blaze began. But when Thomas Riley began presenting our defense, Evelyn's performance faltered. Letter after letter was read aloud, each one revealing another layer of her corruption and desperation. The courtroom erupted when the letter to Judge Hargrove was read, clearly showing collusion between Evelyn and the court. "My dear cousin, I find myself in need of your assistance with a delicate matter. Colonel Ellington has become dangerously attached to a slave who poses a threat to the natural order of our society. I believe legal intervention may be necessary to resolve this situation before it spreads to other plantations. Your discretion and cooperation would be most appreciated." The judge had no choice but to recuse himself, and a new judge was brought in from Savannah, a man with no family connections to Evelyn and a reputation for fairness. By the third day of testimony, it was clear that Evelyn, not I, was the real criminal. The fire had been set by men she had hired. The charges against me were fabricated, and the entire case was part of an elaborate scheme to force the colonel into marriage. The financial evidence was particularly damaging. Riley presented a detailed analysis of Evelyn's debts, showing that she owed money to opium dealers, dressmakers, jewelers, and banks throughout Augusta. Willow Bend Plantation was mortgaged to the hilt, and she had been selling slaves and land to meet her obligations. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Riley said in his closing argument, "this case is not about a dangerous slave inciting rebellion. It is about a desperate woman who orchestrated an elaborate fraud to cover her crimes and force an unwilling man into marriage. Miss Langford set fire to innocent people's homes, fabricated evidence, and corrupted the legal system, all to satisfy her greed and jealousy. When Evelyn finally took the stand in her own defense, I watched her carefully constructed world crumble around her. Under cross-examination, she admitted to her opium addiction, her financial ruin, and her manipulation of the legal system. "You orchestrated this entire affair," Riley said. "Not out of concern for public safety, but out of jealousy and greed." "She's just a slave," Evelyn screamed, her composure finally breaking completely. "An ugly, worthless slave who should be grateful for whatever attention she gets. How dare she think she's better than me?" The courtroom fell silent at this outburst, and I saw several jury members exchange uncomfortable glances. Evelyn had just revealed the ugly truth that lay beneath her beautiful exterior. She was a woman so consumed by jealousy and hatred that she was willing to destroy innocent lives to get what she wanted. "Miss Langford," the judge said sternly, "you will control yourself in my courtroom." But the damage was done. Evelyn's mask had slipped completely, revealing the petty, cruel woman beneath the beautiful facade. The verdict was swift and decisive. All charges against me were dropped, and Evelyn was arrested on charges of arson, perjury, conspiracy, and fraud. Her reputation was destroyed. Her plantation would be seized to pay her debts, and her future lay in ruins. As I walked out of that courthouse, a free woman, legally still a slave, but free in every way that mattered, I felt something I had never experienced before. Complete victory over an enemy who had underestimated me. But the victory was bittersweet. I knew that my legal freedom was temporary, dependent on the Colonel's continued protection, and I knew that Evelyn, even in defeat, would not simply disappear. The real test would come in the months ahead, as we tried to build a life together in a world that saw us as master and property. But for now, it was enough to have proven that intelligence and determination could triumph over prejudice and cruelty. Evelyn Langford had tried to destroy me with fire and false accusations. Instead, she had destroyed herself with her own arrogance and hatred. The ugly slave she had dismissed as worthless had proven to be the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced. And this was only the beginning of her downfall. This was the story of Lila Harper, the woman who turned a vicious insult into a legacy of liberation. After the trial, she and Colonel Ellington fled to Philadelphia, living openly as partners. When the Civil War erupted, they returned south to found schools for the newly freed. Lila taught thousands until her death in 1897, proving the mind is mightier than any chain. Evelyn Langford died broke in Augusta in 1864, erased by the addiction that devoured her empire. If this story of hidden genius and sweet justice fired you up, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an untold American epic. Drop in the comments, what shocked you most? The secret library, the courtroom takedown, or Lila's final triumph? Your thoughts fuel the next video. See you in the shadows of history.